So welcome everybody to another in the CWS Wildlife webinar Chronicles. And we're really excited to do this one on human-primate interactions with three wonderful primatologists who we have with us today. We have with us Dr. Catherine Hill, Dr. Anindya Sinha, and Dr. Kimberly Hawkings. And I'll briefly introduce each of them. It's just such an honor to have them with me here, and very excited to talk to them about today's topic. So Dr. Catherine Hill, or Kate, is a professor of anthropology at Oxford Brookes University. Her research focuses on people-wildlife interactions and the human dimensions of conservation. She's currently working with research students on these issues in several places, including Uganda, Guinea, and the UK. And she's also got such wonderful insight into the people side of these interactions, and it's going to be very interesting to see what she has to say. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you.
We also have with us Dr. Anindya Sinha, or Rana, as we all lovingly call him. And he's a professor and dean of academic affairs at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. He has wide-ranging interests spanning areas of behavioral ecology, cognitive psychology in primates, molecular genetics, evolution biology, and also the philosophy of biology. And he also happens to be my advisor, and it's just so wonderful to have him here supporting me as always in everything I do. Finally, and also very excitingly, we have with us Dr. Kim Hawkings, who is a senior lecturer of conservation science at the University of Exeter, and she works in animal behavior and conservation biology. She's currently conducting research, again, in a very wide variety of fields, including human-wildlife interactions and applied animal conservation, primate behavioral flexibility, cognition in anthropogenic habitats, and great ape tool use and material culture. So we've got a very, very wide range of expertise with us here today. So welcome all, and thanks so much for being with us here. I see people are still joining us. It's nice to see so many people here today. So why don't we jump right in? And I'm going to start with perhaps a more personal question about how each of you found yourselves in this field. How did you come to work with primates and by extension, their interactions with people? Let's start with you, Kim.
Thank you. Sorry, I've just been able to unmute myself. Yeah, so I started, I've always loved animals. I've always had a soft spot for the great apes and wanted to work with chimpanzees. And I'm from the same town as Jane Goodall, which helped. So my childhood, I was bombarded with information about Jane Goodall, and I was kind of inspired through that. And then I did an undergraduate degree with the University of Liverpool, and my dissertation supervisor was Professor Robin Dunbar. So again, that gave me a stepping stone, and then he encouraged me to do a PhD, and it kind of snowballed from there. And I think the first time I got truly interested in human great ape interactions was when I was in Budongo Forest in Uganda, and I saw a chimpanzee speared to death next to a sugarcane plantation. And so I think that's when I realized the complexities of national parks and national park boundaries that border agriculture. And then I went on to do my PhD at a site called Bosu in Guinea, and I was looking at human-chimpanzee coexistence. And people in Bosu believe that chimpanzees are their totems, and they protect them, and that allows them to live on these three small hills that are surrounded by quite high human populations. And it was just fascinating, the behavioral adaptations they were showing to living in this environment. And since then, I've set up a research site with other colleagues called the Chimpanzee Cantonese project. And so again, people are incredibly tolerant within this landscape. And so it allows me to, along with my students and postdocs, to explore some of these kind of interesting human-primate coexistence questions. Because there are also other primates, it's not just about chimpanzees, but I do have a soft spot for them. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kim. I think it's, it's so different from the narrative that we usually hear about chimpanzees. And I think most people who are interested in primates and who know of Jane Goodall always think of chimpanzees in the rainforests of Gombe, and they don't really think of them as species that interact with people, especially
Yeah.
not in that manner. Yeah.
Exactly. I think there's been this whole idea that chimpanzees need to live in these pristine habitats and they're not flexible enough to exploit human impacted landscapes. And that narrative has started to change. And so we're seeing that gorillas do that, orangutans are doing the same. And to be honest, I think these ecologically flexible primates are some of the most interesting. So, I mean, look at the macaques in India, they're incredible. I could just sit and watch them for hours. They're always up to something, there's always something going on. So yeah, I think that they're incredibly interesting species to study.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. What about you, Kate? How did you get into this field?
In some ways, not dissimilar to Kim. I was always interested in animals. I actually failed to get into vet school as an 18-year-old. So went to do zoology and psychology at the University of Reading and met a primatologist there, Hilary Box. So had the opportunity to study primates alongside the behavioral ecology that I was doing as a zoologist, and got interested in primates, went to do a master's in biological anthropology in London with Bob Martin. So I had a great opportunity to be introduced to a very different perspective on primatology. And Bob encouraged me to go and do a PhD. So I ended up doing a PhD in Sierra Leone on female territoriality and male-male competition in dino monkeys. So nothing to do with conservation, nothing to do with people, or so I thought. But I ended up running the research station alongside doing my doctoral fieldwork. And as a consequence, I was the first port of call for local farmers who would arrive and knock on the outside of my tent door and say, Mrs., your bush pig has just destroyed my crop, your bush cow has done this, the chimpanzees have taken something else. And so that for me was my first introduction as a very naive 20-year-old. It's the idea that actually sharing space with the wildlife that I loved and revered and thought was fantastic actually had some very significant costs for people. And so it was through the generosity and kindness of those Sierra Leonean farmers, some of the poorest people in the world at the time, that I actually decided my experience with them and the opportunity to talk with them about what they were experiencing was the thing that made me come back, finish my PhD and decide if I really wanted to have anything to do with conservation, I needed to start to work from the human side and understand it from people's perspective. So that's where my switch came. So I really switched from the animals to the people at that point.
That's, I think that mirrors a lot of what happens on ground. I think many of us find ourselves, in the field out of love for animals, but it's so hard to ignore how much a part of the system people are. That's quite wonderful. Rana, what about you?
Yeah, so thanks, Ishika. I've had a very different trajectory from both Kim and Kate. I've, of course, grown up watching monkeys in my backyard and the interactions they've had with people. And of course, this is a very different community from that Kate worked with. And so these were ordinary middle-class citizens, and they've been interacting with macaques all their lives. I, of course, went on to do a PhD. I studied botany and then went on to do a PhD in molecular biology. But at the end of it, I thought I should return to my animals because that's what really interested me, like Kim was saying. And I thought, and again, this Kim would find interesting, I thought there's been so much of work on the great apes and nobody looked at the macaques. And I thought I would study cognition. So my entry was really to understand cognition and adaptability to various habitats. I did not necessarily look at anthropogenic habitats to start off with. I wanted to understand the evolution of the mind going back beyond what we know about the great apes. And of course, then you realize that much of the intelligence that the macaques use, as Kim just pointed out, is in their interactions with people. And so it was just such a natural step for me to then ask, what is the nature of this relationship, and how do both macaques and people, how do they negotiate, right? And it's just quite amazing, the variability that we see in India, and I'm sure everyone's aware. Uh, the way a macaque interacts with a human being in any part of the country is so different from that in other parts of the country, and even within the same community. And so the most important sort of philosophy that drives my research is individuality, as many of you who have worked with me know. And so I've just been interested in the uniqueness of every macaque individual relationship, and that naturally takes into account not only the broader ecology, but the phylogenetic inertia that these species have gone through, local adaptability, behavioral flexibility, and of course, cognition, and how cognitive abilities are used by both these individuals to build up their relationship, maintain it, and sometimes break it down.
Thanks for that, Rana. I think, what's really nice, which you highlighted so nicely, was that people are also primates and so similar in their cognition to all of these species that we love to watch and study so much. And there's so much, which is why, at least personally, I feel that this is one aspect of interaction which is particularly interesting because of how similar we are to those species. Which actually brings me to my next question for all of you, which is we often tend to look at people's interactions with primates as a binary. We think of it as good versus bad, or harmony or intolerance versus conflict. But all of you have seen through your work that it's so much more intricate and complicated than that. It's not so simple. So could each of you maybe highlight some of the finer aspects of these interactions that you've come across in your work? Perhaps you could start with Kate this time.
Okay, yes. I think probably thinking back to my fieldwork in Uganda, particularly with farmers, where most of my fieldwork has been on this particular topic. And when I first started working with particular groups, the rhetoric was very strongly anti-baboon from many of the farmers when I first met them. But as I got to know them and as they got to know me, and probably as they began to trust me more and to understand that I was not necessarily in the same the same perspective as some of the other researchers that they'd seen, they took me on board as I was their researcher because I was interested in them rather than the animals. And actually the ways that they spoke about baboons began to change. And one of the things that really struck me was the kinds of phrases that would come out when people were reflecting on what the baboons had done. And yes, baboons can certainly cause a lot of damage, was that people would say, well, after all, they're only trying to make a living. They're just doing what we're doing. And that, yes, so there was this kind of, it's not a conflict, but a sort of a multifaceted way of talking about and thinking about these animals. But when they talked with conservationists, researchers, primatologists, it was very much baboons are bad, chimpanzees are good. And I think the emphasis there was because the local researchers were primarily chimpanzee specialists. And so they were aware that that was a more acceptable way of doing it. But actually, they were much more measured in their views of all of the different animal species when given the opportunity to really to talk with somebody who they thought did not have the same agenda as the other researchers. So I think for me, that was one of the key things that came out of working with them.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because like you mentioned, you can have both a negative and a positive outlook kind of co-occurring at the same time for the same person for many different reasons. And yeah, I feel it like it doesn't do justice to the interactions when you don't give voice to some of those mixed feelings as well. What about you, Kim? How has it been for you?
Yes, so I touched upon where I'm currently doing my work. So it's Cantonese National Park, and it's just over 1,000 square kilometres, and you've got 20,000 people living within the national park. So it's a very different type of situation that we see in other parts of Africa, where you've got this more pristine national park and quite hard boundaries. And so I think what I've learned from that is that it's absolutely impossible to understand what any of the wildlife are doing without taking everything we do takes human activities, human behaviors into account. It has to, even down to the areas of the home range that chimpanzees are using, because people are using that environment as well. They overlap in over 25 different plant resources. And that's just looking at the fruits. I mean, everything, these species, including humans, are all intertwined. So it's impossible to understand the ecology of chimpanzees and other wildlife without taking humans into account. It's just not possible. And also how human activities are changing. So changes in rows, changes in slash and burn agriculture, so swidden agriculture, the landscape is constantly changing. And when you've got adaptable species like chimps and other primates, they're able to adapt to that and use it to their advantage as well. So again, understanding human activities is key. We also know that there are over 6 different ethnic groups within the national park, and each ethnic group has a different perspective on chimpanzees. So we have the Nalu that were the local guardians, the initial guardians of the land, and then they allow different ethnic groups to farm on the land. So every time you're talking to different groups of people, you need to be aware when you're talking to men, women, youth groups, you need to be aware of different perceptions and attitude to primates, but also, yeah, be mindful about how chimps or baboons might be impacting people when you talk about them. Not just assume that people have got the same positive opinions of chimps than we have, and understand that it's you can work somewhere for 10 years and still not understand everything that's going on. And people sometimes think there's these, Kate can probably explain this a lot more eloquently than me. She supervised PhD students also who work in Cantonese, but for example, chimpanzees can be just regular chimpanzees, but they can also be associated with some kind of magical world. And so that I won't go into now, but it's you need to work somewhere for a long time to understand these things. And that's why collaborating with social science is absolutely key. I don't do that work myself, but I collaborate with social scientists who do.
Yeah. No, I think that's another really important point where, it's hard for a single researcher to don so many hats, but to actually understand what's going on, you have to. And it's good to bring on people who know how to do something better than you if you can't, as long as it means understanding the system better. Yeah. It actually, some of the things you said about the chimps also, we relate to closer home as well, which I'm sure Rana will tell us about now, where there is so many different kinds of interactions that we see here. Rana, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Shika. Yeah, so I think my area of study is so strikingly different from that of both Kate and Kim, and it's so wonderful that 3 of us can exchange notes here. I, of course, began with a forest, protected area, but as if you've seen the Indian protected areas, you realize that they are not protected from humans at all. And so we started looking at processes of urbanization, by which I mean when tourists come in and they feed the monkeys, it changes their lives forever. And they start gravitating towards human habitations, and a new set of relationships start developing, right? So having said that, you then move in to human habitations where we've had macaques who've lived all their lives and they've been living for generations. In fact, there is a wonderful poem from Tamil Sangam poetry, which is from southern India. And this poem is about 2000 years old, where it talks about the monkey in the town's commons. So for 2000 years, these macaques have been living with people. We've been co-evolving, coexisting. And here, what I want to point out is when you want to look at the intricacies of human, non-human primate interactions, the first and foremost is the philosophy, the cultural philosophy that drives people to respond to other species. And India is fairly unique in this sense because our cultural sort of heritage and our classical literature has always pointed out to a continuum that exists across species, right?
Mm.
Fact, if you go into much of this literature, you'll realize that good and evil almost doesn't exist in Indian mythology, in Indian thinking. It's always gray. Our epics always talk of grays. So therefore, every relationship that a human has with a non-human individual perhaps spans this entire domain. And it's extremely difficult to generalize. Of course, at some level, we can look at how community attitudes are shaped. And of course, there are cultural influences on them. But I think what really drives these interactions, and I'm sure Ishika, in the course of her master's dissertation, has seen this as well, is really individuality. It's again, so I'm sorry to hark back into what I started off by saying, but I think each individual human, shaped by her or his cultural attitudes, personality features, the local conditions under which he or she is coexisting with a non-human animal, as well as the nature or the behavior of the protagonist, of the other individual, really shapes the relationship. So I think if I wanted to summarize in one line, if I look at every human macaque relationship, each is unique. I really will be hard pressed to say what generalizes these relationships. And of course, I am in a situation, as I said, very different from that of Kate or Kim, where they're dealing perhaps with more homogeneous communities who perhaps have lifestyles which often come into conflict with that of the chimpanzees, which is true for the macaques as well, but it's again in a continuum. It's not true for everyone. So perhaps I have that advantage of being able to look at intricacies at the individual level, which sometimes is difficult to achieve when you have other communities that are responding much more strongly as a community.
Mm.
I think, Rana, you've also covered, something that I wanted to eventually come to talking about during the course of the webinar. And so I'm going to jump ahead to asking you, a lot of this work in terms of acknowledging the individuality and the fact that it's so hard to generalize when it comes to these complex interactions. And you can't always just spit out a nice, clean number of what that interaction is at the end of these very long-term studies sometimes. So how easy is this to communicate to the larger world of traditional ecological audiences? Because this is very new. It's not a very comfortable space for many ecologists who are very used to having their neat, clean numbers in place. Kim, you've been nodding along with me as I said that. Why don't you start?
So no, it's a really interesting point because ecologists, we want to or study animal behavior, you want a significant finding at the end. You want some quite straightforward generalizations. But the more you start looking into the social sciences and individual differences, it can be incredibly difficult to do that. So as an ecologist, you tend to make broad assumptions and broad generalizations about human behavior, which of course, in some ways you need to do because you need to try and understand how, say, primates are responding to people. So it would be very difficult to, if you have 1,000 people in a neighboring village, to really generate any statistical analyses which take account for individual differences of 1,000 people. And then, of course, you even grouping people, men and women, it can be quite challenging to. So, from the behavioural perspective, it's incredibly difficult to do with large sample sizes that, again, we're encouraged to use. So, I would love to ask Rana more about how he does this and how, so I can imagine the data collection side is one thing, but analysing those data and trying to capture that complexity, how do you do that?
Yeah. So that actually, thank you, Kate. That actually brings me to something that Kim was talking about earlier. My work has now actually moved more into the social sciences, and I've been called a traitor by many of my natural science colleagues because I have virtually, believe me, I've virtually given up on quantitative sampling, on statistical analyses, because they don't make sense to me anymore, right? So basically, now I tell stories and I talk to an audience which, of course, knows these monkeys because most of them have experienced it. It's not a very unnatural phenomenon to be talking about macaque human interactions. And I tell stories which are
I think we've briefly lost Rana there. Maybe his internet connection is not so great. Maybe I could ask Kate to speak to this a bit more until he reconnects.
Oops. Okay, yes. Interesting that Rana says that he has been called a traitor, moving from a quantitative to a qualitative perspective. I have also been similarly labelled at times by quite eminent people now and again. I've learnt not to take too much notice of it, I have to admit. I've probably developed the hide of a rhino over my career as a consequence. But I started off as a quantitative scientist, and I tried, when I first started to work on people, I tried to use the same kind of techniques and same sort of perspectives. And I think for me, what really stood out was that the questions I was interested in, I couldn't answer with the quantitative techniques I'd been trained in. And when I used those quantitative techniques, it very soon became really clear to me that the information I was getting was garbage, because I didn't know how to ask the questions. I didn't know what questions to ask. And so for me, it's been a strong, or quite a steep learning curve. But I have switched to virtually only qualitative methods in my own work now. I would say I find it harder than quantitative methods, much harder for me. But it's interesting, this challenge of how you communicate that to more quantitatively minded people. And what I found is it's very difficult to get things published in mainstream conservation journals if you're using qualitative approaches. But what I do find is that at conferences, even when talking with very, very strongly quantitative people, there is quite a lot of interest, and people have invited me to workshops as a consequence of hearing my qualitative take on things. So it's as if I'm being allowed in behind the scenes, but I'm not actually finding it very easy to communicate to a new audience. I'm forever writing for the audience who thinks the way I do, which is a real shame, because I would like to get something out to those that don't think the way I do. So I don't know if I answer your question, but
yeah, I think you definitely confirmed my suspicions that it's not going to be easy for people who are getting into the more qualitative side of things, but which, like you said, is a shame, because clearly that is what we need to do in order to really understand what's happening on ground and with so many of these interactions. Yeah, hopefully if you keep speaking at a lot of these conferences and on webinars like this, people will start being more interested in the qualitative side of things. So do you feel that we need to also, shift in our vocabulary of how we do this research? We've got such hard terminology for human wildlife conflict and interaction, and now that we have an increased understanding of how and why species interact, how do we build this new dictionary and kind of move forward to better understand and communicate these issues? Kim, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think really Kate is the person who could be answering this. She's been a pioneer in terms of publishing on this exact subject, and how we need to move away from using terms like raiding, crop braiding, conflict, but it's so difficult to do. I'm very, very conscious, especially when Kate's in the audience, that I don't use these words, and I've actually started to move to human-primate interactions now. But the problem when people don't understand in a research area and you talk about human-primate interactions, it's like there's a myriad of options available to them. When you talk about human-primate conflict, everyone's like, okay, they understand what that means. So I find it difficult with undergraduate students, especially, trying to convey what human-primate interactions is, because it's a lot broader, necessarily broader, but it can be quite difficult. But we need to, because just by talking about human-primate conflict, you're just talking about a very small proportion of the way that humans and primates interact. So of course we need to move away from this type of language. But even the name of IUCN groups, Kate, it's the Human Wildlife Conflict Group, and I know there's a lot of people pushing against it, but whether that comes from the more biologically focused people that just see the way that wildlife are negatively affecting people is, and whether it's because of this viewpoint, this Western viewpoint, where it's almost like we can only view wildlife as negatively impacting upon us. So it becomes, maybe that's a term that's really been driven by Western societies. But maybe I'll leave it to Kate to disentangle what I've just said.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, no, I certainly have written about this topic, and I think it's very important that we think very carefully about the terminology and the labels that we use, because I think in certain contexts, the way we talk about things actually drives the way we think about them and interpret them, and it narrows our vision and narrows our understanding. So for me, most of the conflicts around wildlife are really much more to do with conflicts between different groups of people who have different values, different beliefs, different agendas, and often power differentials between those groups. So that I'm not saying that what the animals are, the behavior of the animals isn't problematic in places. Yes, it is, or it can be. But in my experience, in many cases, not all, but many cases, actually, even where you can, with technological interventions, albeit simple ones, minimize or reduce, sort of remove the impact of animals on people's interests, often the rhetoric of conflict continues, which suggests that what we're looking at is, in certain situations, there are other aspects, other layers to this conflict, and it's much more to do with the human relationships involved. So if we use this term, human-wildlife conflict, for me it sets up a dichotomy of this is an issue between an animal and a person. And actually, that's really not how we should understand it. It's part of a whole system of relationships and interactions. And we have to disentangle them and kind of work our way through them. And we'll often end up with looking at things and realizing that what we've got is aspects of things like identity conflict between different groups of people, with long histories of disenfranchisement and disempowerment between those groups. So whilst I understand why people want a simple label, I think when in certain contexts, that simple label is actually, it's making the problem appear, it's making it into a problem, and it's making it to be a relatively straightforward and obvious problem. And often we're missing the point. And as for the IUCN, yeah, Human Wildlife Conflict Task Force, we are split, but actually it was the IUCN, the higher echelons of IUCN who insisted that it have that title rather than the group themselves.
I see. We also, Rana's rejoined us. So Rana, just to catch you up, we were talking about, redefining the dictionary and coming up with a more relevant vocabulary for these interactions in general. And, to go a step further, in India, we have this constant narrative of monkey menace, which we find constantly propagated, not just by media, but also by a lot of researchers. And so what's your take on that, Rana?
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry. I got the internet just failed and I couldn't get back in. Yeah. So I think overall, it depends on what is the perspective that you are talking about. I mean, I think there is absolutely no doubt that across large swathes of the country, especially in agricultural areas, rhesus macaques in the north, and to a lesser extent, the bonnet macaque in southern India, do raid crops. They do come into gardens. They do come into your kitchens, right? And it therefore, sometimes we need to look at it in terms of the losses that are being sustained, right? And the losses can be enormous when you have hordes of rhesus macaques descending. They can destroy crops which have been nurtured for over a year, maybe, or half a year, and can take away entire livelihoods. There are stories in Himachal Pradesh or in Uttarakhand of villages being abandoned because of rhesus macaques. I once met a gentleman who said he would never let his daughter marry someone in a village where there are rhesus macaques because she would starve. And so you can imagine that there are sociological implications of many of this, but these remain restricted, right? And so when you talk of a monkey menace, it is a menace for the farmer. It may be slightly less of a menace for certain other communities where the losses are not very high. And then I want to just highlight that there are communities where, again, there is no black and white. So it's very fascinating that when we studied macaque human relationships in many of our urban centers, those communities who perhaps have much less in terms of resources, who are perhaps struggling much more in some sense for their daily existence, are far more tolerant of the macaques than are those who live in gated communities, who perhaps have one macaque visiting them once a year and they might take away a sandwich or a banana. And they are the ones who are resisting the macaques far more. And for them, it's a menace. But if you really look at the practical implications of these interactions, if someone is going to suffer from rabies as a result of a monkey bite, it is not the individual who calls this a menace, right? So, in some sense, there is this very idiosyncratic sort of divide between how certain communities and individuals respond to the macaques, and it's extremely difficult to generalize. So, therefore, again, I would come back to saying, which is what I was saying earlier, that I think we need to talk about the unique nature of every relationship with its accompanying benefits and losses, right? There are people who would say, yes, I do lose a certain amount of food to the monkeys, but my child loves them, and I feed my child while I'm watching the monkeys, and there is a bond. The child feels attracted to the monkey. How do I explain to her that they also cause harm? So, how do you even try and uh, generalize this, right? How do you even try and describe this, except in terms of individual accounts? And that's what I was saying when I got cut off. That now that the macaques themselves are interacting with humans, they come and they seek food using some unique gestures. The nature of the relationship changes forever, right? And you go from one category where they say, oh, this is interesting, she's like me, so we are together in this. And this is exactly what I think Kim was saying earlier, that or maybe Kate was, that they also have to survive. It's also their world. And I think people do recognize that they are intruding into the macaques world as well. But for the purposes of living, for the purposes of livelihood, they need to resist them as well. So it's very complex, I think.
Thanks for that, Rana. I think you're very right in acknowledging the fact that there are some places where the issue is very real. And I think, it kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier about a lot of the subjectivity, where the perception of how bad these interactions are or how good they are is so variant. It can be something as simple as your family member liking a monkey and talking about them in a positive way, which overshadows how much loss they feel, or even the other way around. And I think it's wonderful that people like Kate have actually written a lot about the more sensitive ways of putting these interactions. And I think it's not just about changing the vocabulary, like you're saying, it's about using the appropriate term at the appropriate time. No, that's very important as well.
And I think it's important for researchers especially going into a new situation, or even going back to the same site to do the same thing, don't automatically assume that there's conflict, and don't start using that term.
Right.
Just think about letting people characterize interactions for themselves, not because I've seen it so many times, and don't use the word conflict just because the chimpanzees come to take a papaya. Don't use it, because then that terminology, it's not the terminology people are using themselves, and so we're introducing it, which is awful.
Yeah. No, I think that also brings in a lot of the ethical issues with working with people. And, because of course we are going in with an intrinsic love for wildlife, and, we shouldn't make things worse for the people who actually have to be there with them through their lives. That's such an important point. So where do you see this field heading? Where, y'all are very few in a wide, world of primatologists who are interested in looking at these things, but not everyone is looking at them from a qualitative or a more holistic standpoint just yet. Do you feel like there is a general shift in this area, or do you feel that you're eccentric few who are doing it this way? And how do we balance the science and the conservation when it comes to these interactions? Kim, would you like to start?
Well, it's a big question. I'm going to answer from the ecological and behavioural perspective to start with, just because I think that's maybe where I can contribute the most at the moment. There are so many new ways we can try to monitor and understand wildlife living in these shared landscapes. Mine and Kate's postdoc, Helena Bersicola, she started using remote technology, for example, to monitor how chimpanzees are moving across these shared landscapes, and also to understand how people are moving. Of course, you have to be aware of ethical implications with using camera traps or any other devices. But I think it really opens up our understanding of being able to understand animal movements over really large scale, large spatial scales. And I think it's using this kind of remote sensing technology is a really interesting way of gaining a better insight into primate behaviours in these landscapes. So there's certainly opportunity to do that. From what we said earlier, it is very difficult to integrate the social and the biological into the same papers. And I think, again, as Kate said, that it is in conservation biology journals, it's becoming increasingly difficult to publish anything from the human perspective unless it's very quantitative. What I am seeing are these new journals, so like Frontiers in Conservation Science, that I think will be more open to more qualitative science, and I think that's really important. So if you've got places to publish and editors and reviewers that are sympathetic and understand your approach and understand the value of it, that's going to change the whole field. So fingers crossed, we are at this crucial time where interdisciplinary conservation science, I don't use the term conservation biology much anymore because I don't think a lot of the stuff that's published there has any relevance to conservation. So I try to use conservation science because it's necessarily interdisciplinary. We don't need to model everything. I love a good Bayesian model, but we don't need to model everything. You can't model everything. And I think working with Kate has really made me appreciate that. Yes, thank you.
Kate, what do you have to say about this?
Well, first of all, thanks, Kim. I'm glad to know somebody's been influenced. I think if I'm kind of talking from the perspective of sort of looking back, reflecting on, I realise I've been doing this for nearly 30 years. It's terrifying, the thought of how long it's been. I think things have changed and they are changing. Of course, they go slower than what we would like. But particularly thinking as a teacher and as a supervisor of students, and then seeing what some of my students have gone on to do and seeing what other people's students are doing, I think we do have, particularly within primatology, we have a few people or more people now thinking about involving a qualitative component to their work. Sometimes they're trying to integrate the qualitative and the quantitative, which is fantastic, very difficult, but fantastic to do. Others are opting for a more firmly qualitative approach as well. I think that's great. I also work sort of outside of primatology, and a lot of my work now is really with people working with different animal groups, from elephants to bears to crocodiles. And there are people out there who are trying to do this. So there's a bit of a slow groundswell. I would say it's very slow, but I think we will see more of an integration of different perspectives. My feeling now is for quite a few of the students I teach, particularly at master's level, the idea of trying to integrate both isn't as alien to them now as it was even 10 years ago. And I think that's fantastic. So, I hope to see more of us who want to try and work across these disciplinary boundaries. I also think it's important that we don't insist that everybody does. And I think it's really important to let people work in the areas that they're comfortable with. But I would like to see people become more open and more willing to listen and engage and try and communicate with one another. But overall, I'm kind of positive.
Thanks, Kate. Rana, what about you?
Yeah, so I will take it forward from Kate. I completely agree with what Kate said, and I think things are changing. But more personally speaking, I will step one little step even beyond Kim. And I will say that I tell my students, and I know Ishika, we've had many discussions about this in class as well, that is conservation, leave alone biology, is conservation even science? Right? So science tells us what would happen under certain circumstances, but the decision to actually apply a certain process, if I may use the term, is very value driven, right? So conservation is about values, right? And this we face so much in India because who do you prioritize? Is it more important for the gibbons to live in that forest, and we ask the people to step back because there is perhaps competition between them for resources, there's hunting, or do we recognize human rights and say, okay, in this area we can't save the gibbons? These are all very difficult decisions, but they're not science driven. They are more value driven questions. And so therefore, I think over time, I have really moved away from simple quantification, as I was saying. And now we have begun with my current batch of students and collaborators, we've started non-human ethnographies. So I do not do any more ethological studies unless, of course, we are looking at what rate does a macaque take away food, or how much of grains has it actually consumed, what is the monetary loss. Of course, there we do quantification. But when we try and characterize the relationship, we have now completely almost moved into qualitative analyses. And I realize that even if I have to encompass the richness of a macaque's life, I have to do qualitative studies. I have to follow it over days, perhaps, to understand what kind of decisions she is taking rather than doing quantitative sampling. So as far as characterizing human macaque relationships go, I think I've completely stepped away from quantitative studies. And therefore, I come back to Kate to say, yes, I hope that we will be accepted, and it won't be just a few editors and a few journals, but it will be the larger community who will recognize that we are talking about lifestyles, we are talking about value systems, we are talking of conservation as a way of life. It's not just an academic discipline anymore. And we feel this so strongly in India, where every step of the way, we don't have to, just outside my house is my field site, right? And the way I interact with the macaque who's sitting on top of that tree in front of my house is where my academics lies, as well as my livelihood and my life lies. So, yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Rana. And as usual, you've left us with a lot of food for thought there. And I think that's a really nice note for me to perhaps end my end of the questions. And we have one question in from Claire, which is initially directed at you, Rana, where she is interested to hear. She's interested to hear you speak of instances where people were tolerant of macaques, even when they experienced significant economic impact from macaque activities. So could you speak to that? Oh, just a second. Yes. Are you able to speak now?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Claire, I can tell you, it's inexplicable. Let me give you an example from elephants, because that's another species that we've been studying now for many years. And I have once been with an elderly woman whose house was completely destroyed. She was a widow. She was close to 80, and she was weeping because she had lost her house and her grains, food grains. And she said, don't don't take away the elephants, for they live here, and they were here before I came in as a young bride into this village. They were here on the outskirts of the village. Can you just make them not come and destroy my house? How do you solve this problem? What do you do either to her? What can you do for her? What can you do for the elephant? I really don't know. It's about coexistence, but when you look at the individual level, it's almost intolerable coexistence, right? And so I don't have any simple answer. And I want to give you just one more example from the macaques this time. And this is the story of a banana seller in Bandipur who hands out bananas to tourists who want to feed the monkeys. And one of the alpha males in the troop that we've been studying now for almost 25 years, he has developed a relationship with this banana vendor where he comes and sits next to him. They don't look at each other at all. The macaque does not reach out for the bananas. There are other monkeys who are reaching out, and this man holds a stick, but he never strikes the macaque. He just scares them away. And he hands over a banana to Small, which is the name of this male. Small goes away. They don't even look at each other. There is no haptic, no visual gesture. He just goes away. A couple of hours, Small comes and sits next to Raghavendra, this man, once again, and he hands him a banana and he leaves. And this goes on over the day. So here is a man who's willing to give up a few bananas. And the only reason he's doing this, of course, well, two reasons. One is he doesn't have to brandish a stick at this macaque. He has one less thieving macaque. But more interestingly, he says, when I ask him, he's my friend and we share bananas. So a little of my money goes to him in the form of a banana, but then we are friends. So I think, therefore, I agree again with Kim that we can't always model these because economic models won't take into account friendship. Right. So I think, yeah, so that's the kind of relationships that we are talking about. And I think I can only think of qualitative descriptions to describe them, frankly.
Thanks, Rana. Perhaps, Kim, Kate, you could also speak to the second half of Claire's question, where she was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about what kind of issues that people face could affect their tolerance towards different primate species.
Okay, I mean, I think thinking about some of the research, other people's research I'm aware of, I think it varies, as Rana has said, it really varies much it varies between different places, and an important aspect to it, there's the cultural context and the cultural constructs that different groups of people work within. And there's also individual difference. So there's some really interesting work by John Knight, social anthropologist, looking at people-macaque relationships in Japanese mountain villages, where they have a history of outmigration of young members of the population to the urban areas, so that it's primarily older farmers now in the rural areas. And the sort of challenge there is that the macaques are foraging, particularly in people's orange groves, and oranges have symbolic meaning for those people, because it's not so much an economic aspect, but the grandparents send oranges to their younger relatives in the urban areas, and it's that connection between home and sort of urban home that is important. So people they don't tolerate the monkeys foraging in their orange orchards during the orange harvest period, but then during the winter, people feed the monkeys when they come down off the mountain into the village. So on one side, they've got calls for monkey culls and for hunters to come in and cull the monkeys. And then the same group of people are feeding these animals because they feel sorry for them, because the winter is hard. And I actually don't think that very sort of different way of seeing things at different seasons is that unusual for different people. I've seen similar in Uganda. And actually, some of the work I'm doing now with people red kite interactions in the UK, I actually would say we've got some of the same things going on there as well, even within groups of people who think the red kite impacts significantly on their livestock. So it's actually, I think there is so much that is individual, and there's so much that is both societal and cultural. There's also aspects of what you see your neighbours doing. And I think we shouldn't kind of dismiss that actually we are influenced a lot by what we see others doing and the members of our social group. So what becomes normalized becomes quite important, and actually tolerance is influenced by so many of these things, and also our tolerance for things can vary from time to time, from situation to situation, even the same individuals. So I don't think there's any, one or two things we could pick out and say this is always the case. And I would say that works across different animal groups as well, in my experience.
Thanks for that, Kate. We can take another question about the shift that we were talking about earlier within academia. And this question asks about whether this shift in perspective could occur without decolonizing academia and acknowledging caste and class privileges to accept differently lived realities. Maybe Kim, you could start with this one.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think if that's directed more at the Indian context, maybe Rana can answer it in more detail than I can. But just on a general level, of course, we have to acknowledge the historical impacts of kind of Western conservation attitudes and the kind of this exclusion of people from any protected areas, and just the historical context of how conservation has developed over the years. And yeah, we need to fight back against it. One thing that I think is genuinely important, and that I'm finding myself quite difficult to do, is to get enough funds to train Guinea-Bissau students in the UK and to get them as leaders in their field. So I'm a guest when I go to Guinea-Bissau, and anyone who comes to India to study any of your work, we're guests. There should be no expectation of any rights to go and do that. But I mean, I'm finding it really difficult to get the funds to try and train young researchers. And then sometimes you've got language barriers. And so, I mean, that's one of my goals over the next 10, 15 years. And I think it's the future. At the moment, we've just got a biology degree in Guinea-Bissau. It's the first one 3 years ago. And so it's really very small steps, but it's something that I think is possibly one of the most important things we can do to move away from that, to move towards kind of decolonizing primatology and primate conservation. So Rana, I don't know if you can answer, move on from what I've touched upon. You need muting, unmuting.
You'll have to unmute yourself, Rana.
Yeah, thank you. Once in a while I get muted and I think I'm speaking too much. And Ishika is sending me a little message, but sorry. No, well, yeah, Kim, that's so right. And yes, and we are fighting colonial influences tremendously in terms of protectionism vis-a-vis participation. And, you know, this is an old story. But let me just highlight one other way in which works, right? It's easy sometimes to blame other influences, but I think it's tougher to look within, right? And I'll give an example. If you look at macaque translocations that happen, right? And this is a very, very favorite topic of mine. In fact, it's a sore topic of mine, which I keep raising. If you look at translocation, which of course we've been trying to resist, but you know, you can't always, it's done surreptitiously, quietly, illegally. It works down the hierarchy of the human communities, right? So the city center, which has high rises, which has the most influential and affluent people living there, will move them to the city suburbs. And the city suburbs will then move them to the small towns, and the small towns will move them to the hinterland, to the villages, and they will move it to the hamlets in the forest. So it's really a question of transferring the problem to someone else. And here I will again reflect on what Kate said, and I completely agree with her, that much of these human conflicts are mediated through the way we respond to non-humans. And this is such a wonderful example that we are using the macaque to actually transfer our problem to someone else. And they don't have a voice, so they move it to someone else who has an even weaker voice. And how do you resist this, right? So clearly there are different kinds of exploitation. There are different kinds of relations across communities, whether they be caste, whether they be socioeconomic status, those who have a political voice versus those who don't, who are marginalized. And all of this manifests even within the human-non-human relations and our actions against non-humans that we see.
Thanks, Rana. Yeah, I think so many good points coming up, and I wish we had more time to delve into them a little more. And while we are out of time, I think I'm going to take just one last question because I feel it's an important one to take. And perhaps, Kate, you could answer to this one, where Virendra asks about social surveys. And so he says that we often read about questionnaire surveys to be the primary tool for analyzing the perceptions of local communities. Do you think that the process of designing these surveys is still not understood properly and needs to be taught to researchers going into the field? And also requests any best practices if you have any.
Okay, I think that is a great question and a really important one. So I'm delighted that it's been asked. I think quantitative surveys have their place. They definitely do, but they should be seen as the tool to do a sort of quick and widely dispersed investigation of whether the information that's coming out of detailed qualitative case study work is actually representative at the wider level of the population. So in order to be able to produce a good, effective and useful questionnaire, you really need to know what are the questions and what are the priorities and what are the things you've got to focus on. And you can't get that information easily until you have done detailed, qualitative work first. So I would say as best practice, one should do the qualitative case study work first. And through that, through your participants in that, they generate the information about, and they identify the priorities, the questions to be asked, how best those questions can be asked or should be asked. And so it should be driven from the bottom up, if you like, so that you start with the qualitative, you use the qualitative as a way to understand a set of issues or a set of perspectives in a particular location or particular subgroup. And then you may decide you want to find out, well, to what degree is what I've got here representative of perceptions in the wider population? So then you start with a quantitative approach. But I would say what I often see, and it makes me want to cry, quite honestly, because of the amount of work that's gone into it, that I feel it's wasted, is that I see people do, well, we do a big questionnaire, and then we'll do some qualitative work on the side just to kind of fill in the gaps, and think, no, you've got it the wrong way around. Start small, work big. Always start with the detail and then think about how you might extrapolate it beyond that. I'm glad to see Rana's agreeing with me.
Thanks so much for that, Kate. Rana or Kim, do either of you have anything to add to that?
The expert has spoken. I think I completely agree with her, and I couldn't have put it better.
Thank you.
Okay, so we actually do have a few more questions, but since we are a little short on time, maybe we should close the webinar right now. And I just want to say another really big thank you to each of you, Kim, Kate, Rana. It's just been so wonderful speaking with you. And I think we've had some really important discussions today. And hopefully everyone who joined us leaves us with some food for thought. And thank you all for joining in and tuning in today as well. We do this once or twice a month. So do look out. We have more interesting stuff coming up as well. So thanks so much for doing this with us today.
And thank you, Ishka, for your invite. It was an honor.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ishka. I've really enjoyed it. And it's been lovely to see Kim and Rana in this situation again. So I haven't seen either of them for a while, but really nice to have such a great engaged audience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And we'll be in touch, Kate, Kim.
Great.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.